need to confront the North's most notorious barbarians. We've tackled some terrifying warrior nations in this series. The Huns, the Vandals, the Goths. But when it comes to bellicosity, no one has quite as fearsome a reputation as the Vikings.
You know, people get so much wrong about the Vikings. They didn't wear these ridiculous helmets for a start. These were invented in the 19th century by a stage designer working on a Wagner opera. He had to make one of the singing Vikings look particularly evil. So he stuck the devil's horns on a helmet. And the Vikings have been lumbered with these helmets ever since.
This is what their helmets really looked like. The only surviving Viking helmet in the National Museum in Oslo.
The Vikings were particularly interesting because while all the other Germanic tribes headed south and became thoroughly Italianate, the Vikings stayed in the harsh and windy north, where they clung to the old ways. So they were a barbarian nation of a pure and exciting type. Most of the time they were simple farmers, tending the land, keeping livestock, growing what they could. But in the lands of the Vikings, you can't go very far without encountering water. And this constant presence of the sea had turned them into superb sailors. Exactly where they reached is still fiercely debated, but they certainly got to Greenland and then to Newfoundland. The Vikings discovered America a long, long time before Columbus. So boatmanship was one of their great achievements, and another of their great achievements was art.
In the great years of Viking expansion, roughly 800 AD to roughly 1100 AD, the Vikings put almost as much energy into making their own art as they did into stealing other people's. This trefoil Viking brooch was modelled on the buckles used by Roman soldiers on their sword belts. The Vikings adapted it and turned it into a brooch for ladies. Much of what they made is so intricate and fine, it's difficult to see. So to make absolutely clear what adventurous creatives they were, I've brought you to Oslo, to one of the great Viking museums, where I wanted to show you this whopping great nautical masterpiece.
On the 8th of August 1903, a Norwegian farmer called Knut Rom knocked on the door of Professor Gabriel Gustafsson of the Museum of Antiquities here in Oslo. While digging on his farm, said Knut Rom, he'd come across a buried ship, and he thought it might be Viking. 2 days later, Professor Gustafsson arrived at the farm and confirmed the discovery of this thing, the Oseberg ship.
Will you look at that, eh? It's made entirely of oak, over 60 feet long, 15 feet wide, decorated at both ends with these boisterous Viking carvings. Inside the ship were 2 dead bodies, an older woman who may have been a queen, and a younger woman, probably her slave, who was buried with her. There were also 14 horses, 3 dogs, and an ox, all sacrificed together and buried with their master. In the stern of the boat was a 4-wheeled cart, the first such Viking cart ever discovered. But no one seemed too sure what the weather was going to be like in heaven, because there were also 4 sledges.
it's the carving of these boats and carts and sledges that makes this particular Viking find so exciting. Look at the elegant line of this ship, how it ends so gracefully up there with the curved head of the snake.
At either end, above the waterline where they can be seen, are these busy expanses of carving, so active and lively. Scores of twisting bodies, clutching hands, staring eyes, sniffing snouts, all jumbled together excitedly. A gymnasium of animal acrobats tying themselves into knots.
You have to get your eye in with Viking carvings, otherwise they can frighten you with all this amazing complication.
Were barbarous, grab them by the ear and tug them here to Oslo. Runes. More runes. And still more runes. All over Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and particularly here in Sweden, you find these magnificent standing stones left behind by the Vikings, covered in wobbly carvings and all these runes. Runes are the bits of writing on the twisty snakes. You usually find them on Viking gravestones. These ones here say Gideor loved her husband and remembers him with her tears. Because they're carved on these mighty stones and not written down on handy bits of parchment or vellum, there's a tendency to mythologize them, to see great truths in the runes. According to Norse mythology, the runes were found by Odin, the supreme god of the Norsemen, while he was hanging from the Tree of Life, the famous Yggdrasil. For 9 days and nights, Odin stayed in the great tree, waiting, hoping, until eventually the runes fell into his hands and revealed themselves to him. Odin passed them to us. Thus, from the start, the runes were associated with magic and the mysteries of the cosmos. This splendid story about Odin up in the trees and the origin of the runes is another example of the extraordinary power that words had in these fateful years. Words, letters, symbols seemed to mean so much in the Dark Ages. They were so loaded. They had such resonance. Actually a simple alphabet. So this shape here, that's a V sound, and that's an A, L, and so on. So that says Valdemar. And in fact, this whole message is, here stands Valdemar in Viking land. The runic alphabet, or foothark as it's called, had 24 letters in it originally. Later on, when the Vikings attacked Britain, they took the runes with them, and the foothark grew to 33 letters. The new letters were needed to describe new sounds. Every time the Vikings conquered a new territory, and new words entered their language, they needed new letters to describe them. So, for example, originally there was no W, and I have to use a V sound for my name, Valdemar. So the runes were never some cobweb-covered dead language fit only for a museum. They were always alive, vibrant, and constantly changing. What a good-looking alphabet it is, too. So energetic and upright. It's based on vertical lines, because verticals are easier to carve, particularly in wood, but also in stone. This vertical emphasis gives the runes a spiky presence and a mysterious relationship with time, as if every mark is somehow counting down the days. The Vikings were the last of the great barbarian nations to convert to Christianity. It wasn't till the 10th century, 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, that paganism's hold on the frozen north was broken. So around here, the paganism was stubborn. And in Viking art, it's often difficult to tell where the paganism ends and the Christianity begins. This is the biggest and most famous of all Scandinavian rune stones, the Yelling stone. It weighs over 10 tons. It's 2.5 meters tall, and as you can see, the entire stone seems to writhe with energy. What a fabulous thing. This inscription here, which goes all the way round, tells us that the Yelling stone was put here by Harold Bluetooth, the energetic Viking ruler who's usually credited with converting the Danes to Christianity. I am Harold, it says here, son of Gorm, and I made the Danes Christians. It's carved on all 3 sides, and on this side there's an image of a giant snake attacking a stylized lion. Now, obviously there are no lions in Scandinavia. It's an image they found abroad, but the Vikings identified with the lion's fighting spirit, so it pops up a lot in their art. It's an image they made theirs. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what lion and what snake? Well, inside the visitor centre at Yelling, there's a coloured replica of the Great Stone, which shows you how the lion and the snake would originally have looked before all their paint fell off. But the most surprising sight is here on the biggest side. It's the culmination of the entire stone. But you can't see it yet. The light has to be exactly right. What you have to do is wait till the twilight begins to work its magic. Can you see it? It's a splendid Viking crucifixion with this stern Christ in the centre, surrounded by all these writhing Viking knots. It's as if the whole stone can't keep still. And I like the way Christ hasn't actually got a cross. He's just standing there with his arms outstretched. So it's obviously another image that's been imported from abroad and is now being misunderstood so confidently